Howdy. Let's get to some of the fun stuff now and create our first virtual machine. So what is a virtual machine? Virtual machine is basically just your own computer in the cloud. You can kind of do whatever you want with it. You can create a bunch of them. You can create one. You can create 1,000. Just basically just a computer in the cloud. And you can have Linux virtual machines. You can have a Windows virtual machine. It's up to you. And you can select different operating systems. So for like Linux, you can have CentOS if you want, Red Hat, Ubuntu, and so forth. So the nice thing about virtual machines and the cloud is you don't have to worry about the physical aspect of a computer. So if you wanted to just play around with, learning Linux maybe, you would have to, if you want to do that at home, you would have to go and buy a server, a physical server. Well, with a virtual machine, you can just do that, through the cloud, through Azure, which is awesome. Another thing with virtual machines is that's the main component of a lot of the cloud things. It is a virtual machine. That's the server that runs just the anything. It could run a web server. It could run a database. It could run, machine learning things. It could run all kinds of stuff. It's just basically, it's the backbone of cloud computing, essentially. So let's get started. Let's dive right in. So we've got our virtual network, we've got an IP, and we've got a security group. So now let's create a virtual machine. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a very basic web server to do this now. So let's search for virtual machines. We have it. And let's add a virtual machine. So there's a lot of options that we can go through virtual machines. So I'll try to cover a lot of them. I won't be covering all of them. All right. So again, we have a subscription. So we're going to use the Azure course. And then we have a resource group, which we're going to use course resource group again. And you see here, we can create the resource group if we wanted to. But we've already created our resource group. Virtual machine name. Let's just name it course VM. A lot of times my naming conventions, you'll see I do a dash like VM, which stands for virtual machine, and then like dash RG, dash SG for security group. That's kind of just something I've gotten used to. I'm not sure if that's the best practice, but that's kind of something that I've done. All right, so again, the region. So where do we want our virtual machine to go? So again, if you remember the previous videos, we want the region closest to, for right now, I'm in Florida, so I kind of want my server to be closer to me. So I'm going to choose US East, since that's the closest region right now. We're going to do no infrastructure, leave this blank, no infrastructure redundancy required. And then an image. So the image is, what type of virtual machine do we want? And defaults to Ubuntu, which is Linux. But you've got a lot of choices here. You've got Windows that you can do as well. We're going to use Ubuntu, but let's also, you can browse more if you want. So there's more, so say maybe we want CentOS, a different one like that. We can search, and we can choose one of these if we want, if one of these defaults doesn't fit us. And you can also use your own images that you create, which we're going to go over in upcoming videos. But for now, let's just use the Ubuntu image here. We don't want spot instances. Spot instances are they're a lot cheaper. It gets a little confusing, but the Azure can kind of terminate those instances at any time. It's basically they have extra servers at the time. So they're like, all right, we can give you these servers to you, but we're going to charge you, pennies on the dollar, but we can take those away from you at any time. So for a web server, that's not what we want to use right now. So we're just going to do no spot instances. And then the size. So we're going to choose the size of the server, so the hardware. So default at two CPUs and 8 gigabytes of memory. And you can see that is $70 a month. Maybe that suits our needs, maybe it doesn't. So let's go to change size. And it's got a bunch of different sizes. And in each of these sizes, they can do a different thing. Like some of these are good for a web server. Some are good for a very high traffic database server. Some are more compute intensive. So depending on what you need, you want to make sure you choose the right size. For us, we're gonna do like a general purpose. Like you can see here, a general purpose type which has the B, D, DV2, things like that. So you can see, here's a D, and it even says on the family general purpose. That's nice. So it kind of tells you what to do. Like if you have like a large database, you probably want to go with like a D series or M or E here. You want one of the memory optimized maybe. You can do a storage optimized, GPU optimized. So there's a lot of different choices, and that can be a little overwhelming. So if you're doing a basic like web server like we are, the B series is fine. The D series is fine. Once you get into more production workloads, you're going to want to, your database, depending on what you use for your database, if you use a VM or a managed database, which we haven't gone over yet, but you might want to use one of these. So let's go. So for the purpose of this, we're going to just keep it here. So and if you see this price of $70 a month, so if we spend this up, we're not going to get charged $70 a month. We're going to get charged, I can't remember if it's by the minute. I believe it's by the minute. I can't remember off the top of my head, which if AWS does it one way, I think, and Azure does it one. Can't remember, but you'll be charged by the minute or by the hour. So if you spend this up, you're not going to get charged $70 right away. You're going to get charged for the amount of time that you have it. So if you spend this up and you have it up for 5 minutes, you might be charged like a couple of pennies, if that. So don't be intimidated by that. So that's why like right now I'm not worried about spending up a $70 machine because, I'm going to be spending it down shortly and I'm going to get charged pennies, if anything. But make sure you have your alerts set up like we went over because, sometimes you forget, and I do forget. So make sure you go back and watch that billing video if you didn't, because you're going to want to set up your billing alerts. All right, so let's select this. We got 2 CPUs and 8 gigs of RAM. So good. And then, so here's our administrator account. So when you create the VM, the way to access your account, you're gonna have one user created by default, so you can SSH to the machine once it's created. So you can use your SSH public key. I'm not gonna go over public keys. Hopefully you're familiar with that. So we're gonna use just password based. But if you're doing production environment, always use SSH public key. You don't ever want to log in with passwords. SSH key is a lot more secure. So if you did have that, you would just choose your username and then add your public key here. But let's just choose a password. But our username, let's just do Will, and let's do a password. All right. And we've got some rules here for inbound ports. So when you SSH to a machine, you need to have port 22 open. This will actually change in a sec once we go to our virtual network. But you need to have port 22 open to SSH, but leave that there just blank, or just leave the defaults for now. All right, so we've got some basic information set up there. So let's go to our disks. So by default, you're going to have an operating system disk. And for the most part, for what we're doing, that's going to be fine, but we'll create a data disk as well. So you have an operating disk which just stores the operating system information. But most of the time, you're going to want to also add a data disk. So a data disk could hold maybe all the code to your web application, maybe. So you have 2 different disks, and it makes it a lot more portable and easier to do. So let's add that disk now, and I'll go over a little bit. And what they're actually called is managed disks in Azure. And in the next video, I'm going to go over a little bit more about what the data disks are. But let's just attach one, and we'll just keep the default name here, a source type. So the source type of the disk, you can choose a snapshot or a blob. A snapshot might be you maybe had a different VM and you backed up your data. So you can restore that data from that like that. Or you can have a storage blob, which we'll get into those later. But we just want an empty disk. And then the size, we don't want the default. We don't want, this is 1 terabyte. We don't need 1 terabyte. So let's just do 16 gigabytes for now. It's good. And then the encryption type, by default, the disks are, any disk you create in Azure is encrypted by default at rest. So when the data is just sitting around in the Azure data centers, it's encrypted at that point. So let's click OK. All right, so we've got a data disk. And all right, so there's different disk types as well: premium, SSD, and HDD. So the standard hard disk drive, you don't really want to use that anymore. That's older. For the most part, standard is probably going to work for you the best. If you're going to do a production web server or database server, choose premium. A little bit faster for your reads and writes. So I would choose that. It's a little bit more expensive, but I'll get into pricing in the next video on how much the storage actually costs. All right, perfect. So we've got that. So we've got an operating system disk, and then we've got our data disk. So the data disk is just nice. It's, we can move that disk around to other machines if we needed to for some reason after this was created. Let's go to networking. All right, so networking. So we need to attach our virtual machine into a network. So we've already created a virtual network here. And you can see we could have actually not done the virtual network, and we could have actually just created it here and all of this, but I wanted to create it before just so you can kind of see the process of kind of what's going on. But if you needed to create something one-off real quick, or you're trying stuff out, you can just come into virtual machines and create everything at that point. So you can even create a public IP as well. But once you get into infrastructure as code, and you start, instead of actually building all this stuff out through the portal, you're going to need to know how all of that works. So I think it's a good idea to teach you all of the individual components of virtual network and public IP, because at some point you're going to need to know that without just creating a one-off. All right, so we've got a virtual network here, and then it's defaulting to that subnet we have here, but we don't want to do that. We want to just use our web server subnet there, and then we want to use our public IP that we created, so we can do web server IP. And the reason we want the web server subnet is because we need to be able to allow web traffic into our machine, so we can have it as a web server. And since we attached that since we have a security group already on that subnet, we don't have to do anything here because we've already secured it at that point. All right, and then there's an option for load balancing. We're not going to do load balancing yet. We'll get into that in a later video. All right, next thing is management. We're going to leave all the defaults here, I believe. There's a few different things you can enable: backups, monitoring, and different things like that, but we're not going to go into that right now. And then advanced. So here's a few different things you can do. So there's extensions. So you can select an extension, and what the extensions do is it allows you to do some kind of action after the virtual machine is set up. So one thing is you can run a bash script if you want. So here, so you can run a bash script. So maybe you want to spin up the machine, and then you want to have it automatically add 5 users to your machine. So you could have a bash script that adds those 5 users, and you can upload it here and have it execute after the machine is actually up and running. And then you also have Cloud Init. Cloud Init is not an Azure specific thing. It's a Linux specific thing, but it allows you to also run post tasks after the VM is created to customize the VM. So actually, what we're going to do today, and this is we're gonna actually use Cloud Init to set up our web server after the VM has loaded. So I'm not going to go into Cloud Init or the extensions right now. We're going to go over Cloud Init and using the extensions in a couple of videos. But you'll see how Cloud Init or the extensions are very, very helpful, especially when you get to auto scaling, because you need to, if you're auto scaling, you might have 1,000 web servers, and you need to be able to get your code, all your web application code, onto those servers somehow when they are automatically scaling up and down. So you don't want a human involved at all. You want that to be all automatic, so you can use, either Cloud Init or extensions to, maybe run an Ansible script or, do different things like that. But we're just going to copy and paste this, and I'll post this link in the comments here of the video, so you can have that and get this code. But we're just going to basically paste that in here for now. And basically what that's going to do is that's just going to create us a very basic nginx server, so we can just have proof of concept that our web server is working, our virtual machine is working. But if you're starting your web server and you just want to run your web server on one virtual machine, you'll probably skip this step and then install nginx manually. I'm not going to get into installing nginx and configuring that because that's kind of out of the scope of this series. But let's do that. So now we can just review and create. So we're going to review and create, and it's going to run some validations. All right, so everything validated, perfect. And we're good. So let's create it now. And this could take a minute, could take 3 minutes, depends on everything. It'll take a few minutes to deploy. All right, so our virtual machine is up and running. Perfect. So what we did with the Cloud Init, we set up a web server. So we should technically have a web server up and running right now. So just to go back to that script, it basically, I'm not going to go through this, but basically just creates a node application and configures nginx to serve the node application. And it's basically just going to say hello world from host. So, how do we know if that works? We don't know if this works at all. So the first thing we can do is we've got a public IP address here. So what we can do is that if we go to this IP, we should be able to see that the web server is working and get this hello world from host gone out. So let's copy that and let's open up a new tab and paste. And if you look, this has taken a little while, and that's because something is not set up correctly in our security groups, I think. So let's take a look at, because this nginx is serving at port 80 right now. So we need to be able to allow port 80 in. So let's go back to our security group. Let's find a security group. And some more things are created here. But here's our security group. And then our inbound rules. Let's look at our inbound rules. So let's see why port 80 is not allowing us in. Okay, so if you look here, this was a mistake on my part. I put the source port range as 80. That's incorrect. We need that to be an asterisk, because we're not where I am accessing the page, I'm not on port 80. We need to be able to, the web server just needs to be open on port 80. Where I am accessing from is not port 80. So I think doing that will allow us in. But while we're here, we also need to allow port 22. Since we already used our own subnet and security group, it didn't automatically enable port 22 for us, so we can SSH in. So let's enable port 22 now. So we'll leave source of any, that. Destination, we can do any. We can just do 22 for the port. And then just change that to 22. The priority there is fine. And let's add. And these usually take a couple of minutes to take effect. Yeah, so when you open up to port 80, even once it says it's done, it usually takes a few minutes for the website to actually come up. So just be patient with it. All right, so we've got that. So let's see if this works now. Not yet. So I think we just need to give it a sec. All right, there we go. So now it works. Hello world from host. Course VM. That's our host. Perfect. So our web server is working. So we just created a virtual machine with a web server. Very simple, right? All right. So the other thing we want to do is, when you create the VM, we use the Cloud Init script to set up our nginx and everything. You're probably not. You might not use that, or you might manually do it. It depends on your situation. But the other thing we need to do is we need to be able to SSH into our server. So let's do that. So we can use that same public IP address here. And we set our username to Will when we were first setting that up. So I should be able to SSH Will at that IP address. And it does not want to allow me to log into that. Why not? Oh, I must have used a... That's odd. They gave me... I'm reusing a IP address that I had from a previous build, which is interesting. So I can just remove this. You can kind of ignore what I'm doing here. But yeah. So essentially what that was noticing, that saw that I had an existing machine at that same exact IP address. And it noticed that it changed. But I guess Azure tries to kind of reuse the IP addresses, I guess. I've never seen that. But that's fine. So we can just do yes. And now we just need to enter our password. If you use the SSH option or the SSH keys option instead of the password option, you wouldn't have to insert a password because it would read your SSH key and you'd be good. So perfect. So now we're in our virtual machine. So we're inside a machine. It's this machine that's in the cloud. We have no physical attachment to it and everything, but we have it. We have, and it's just in the cloud, which is awesome. So you can spin these up as much as you want, up and down, and you're just going to get paid by the hour on how much you use it. So you can play around, and if you're on the free tier, just play around with it. Once you get in, you can install nginx if you wanted to. You could install Apache. You could add users. You can do a bunch of different things that you want. And there's some other things you can see in the virtual machines. You can have, let's see, just to go over a few things on here. You can see the CPU average if you want. Let's collapse that. CPU average, network, and just different things. You can restart it here, stop it, delete it. What else is it? Of course, there's tags. You can see the disks that we added. So we've got one operating system disk, and then we've got one data disk. Then the size, that's our size. If we wanted to, we could change this size right here if we wanted to. It would take down the server for a brief second, but it could just change it. You don't have to recreate the entire virtual machine if you don't want to. You can just, it'll be like, oh, I want to change from this. I want to go from 2 CPUs to 4. So we could select that and resize if we wanted to. But that's the basics of virtual machines in the cloud. It's fairly simple, but there's a lot of power with it. So We'll be going over virtual machines a little bit more as with auto scaling. So we'll have it so we can have a web server that can handle lots of traffic that will scale up and down based on demand, and then that will create it could create 500 virtual machines if we needed to, and automatically deploy everything.